My name is Wendy Mackay. My great-grandfather was George Chukwi. He came out from Shanghai to the Lawrence Goldfields. He met and married my great-grandmother, Sarah Austin. She was 14 years old and she was from Australia. They were the first mixed marriage to happen in Lawrence.
Well, the first mixed marriage was the George Chukwi to Sarah Ann Austin in November 1869. She was heavily pregnant. She was pushing 14, 15. You're legally allowed to marry at 15. There was a big thing at the time. The European men drank, were a bit hard, a bit violent. The Chinese were better workers, a bit more loving, less language. But if you're a good submissive wife, a bit firm, the Chinese relationship with the European woman got on. So she married him, but to get married, the registrar said you have to have a house. So he had to go and buy a piece of land, little plot, and build a house.
In 1865, the Otago Provincial Council actually invited the Chinese to come because the Chamber of Commerce members thought that they were good people. They went to the Victorian goldfields in Australia, that they were law-abiding, hard-working, and above all, they would be quite willing to rework the goldfields.
Yeah, it was a really important factor to remember with the Chinese. The beginning point in New Zealand is that invitation that was issued from Dunedin to solve a crisis on the Otago goldfields. You know, with the discovery of new fields on the west coast, there had been a huge exodus of mining labour that direction. They never came back. So we had all these goldfields lying fallow for want of labour, and that caused a crisis in Dunedin because the flow of gold had made this a very prosperous place. They were particularly noted for reworking old ground, and that was really what was going to be needed in the next phase of Otago gold mining. So that invitation was extended. You know, a representative came over to check the scene out, took word back, and then the first groups began to come over here. They also sought guarantees that the Chinese would be treated the same as the Europeans in terms of their legal rights.
There was articles in the Tuapeka Times that the Celestials were a better match, and the young girls were chasing the Chinese. Not all, but some, and they weren't interested in Europeans. And the young girls were from Scottish or Irish descent, and the Chinese were perceived as a better catch, partly because they're more stable, didn't drink as much, maybe less violent, worked, saved. They gambled, and they did use prostitutes, but they were perceived as a better match. There was social frowning, but if you lived in the camp, you looked like living in a ghetto. You're living away, because Chinese and the mixed race children couldn't live in the town. There's a bylaw that stands to this day.
Well, it was the biggest and earliest Chinese camp and the best documented. Very important to the Chinese gold miners because it was their gateway to and from the goldfields. Their whole aim was to come out and as sojourners and earn money and to take back. However, the Lawrence Chinese camp had well over a dozen of these mixed marriage families, so that was an important component of the population of that 100 residents that they had. At the turn of the 20th century, the discrimination against the Chinese as an ethnic group was very high. It was never actually promulgated, but there was talk about that time of wanting a white New Zealand, and so they didn't want families here of the Cantonese.
Well, the fact that there were all these, increasing levels of legalistic discrimination, the poll tax, and the way it was, raised and raised and raised, and the way that, although the Chinese to begin with didn't want to bring their wives and families out here, subsequently it was very difficult to do that, virtually impossible, and that was, not by chance. Those measures were designed to prevent the development of a Chinese community proper here. So, that's a pretty dark story.
So many of us didn't know, like it was hidden. We just never talked about it. It was really strange, I can't explain it. My mother wouldn't talk about it, and amazed that I could have all this history and not have known about it really. I'll be telling my family, the grandchildren, I want them to know where they came from and where we came from. I want them to understand a part of the history of the country, because that's what it was.